Hello everyone, welcome to the Lightning Ball channel. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do so and activate the notification bell. Your support fuels my continued efforts. In our previous episode, with everyone turning against him, Veldanava precisely eliminated the greatest variable, Chloe, and activated Time Stop, dragging the battle into a divine domain accessible only to top-tier existences. Within the frozen world, Rimuru was struck by soul domination, his soul forcibly extracted on the spot. He collapsed instantly, and the situation plunged into absolute despair. Yet, through Seal's final intervention and the backup mechanisms she had prepared, Rimuru miraculously revived in the form of a pseudo-soul, alive but stripped of both his true soul and Seal's support. Even so, Rimuru chose to step forward. In his unique, soulless state, he became the only being capable of standing on the front line against God, trying to carve out even the slightest chance of survival for everyone else. Then, Veldanava gravely wounded Benimaru, forcing Rimuru into a corner where only a miracle could save them. At that moment, the final battle, one revolving around faith, inheritance, and the fate of the world, truly began. In this episode, we examined Rimuru's uniqueness and Veldanava's irredeemable madness through the eyes of the other powerful figures on the battlefield. Ramiris, in particular, even arrived at a new hypothesis regarding Rimuru's true nature. So, let's get started. The viewpoint shifted to Guy and Luminous. Guy realized that, in the face of Veldanava, there was very little he himself could do at this point. Luminous seemed to have reached the same conclusion. Within the frozen time, she had witnessed two miracles in succession, both Rimuru and Benimaru escaping death. To be precise, Luminous understood that on Rimuru and Veldanava's battlefield, especially under Time Stop, her authority was severely restricted. With magic unusable, she had no meaningful role left to play. She made the decisive call to head to the opposite side of the battlefield to provide support elsewhere. Guy strongly agreed with her judgment. Most immediately, Luminous's role as a battlefield guardian had lost its meaning. The human elites were already being cared for by misery and rain, and in a stopped world, those unable to move were effectively targets with zero defense. Holding the line was pointless. Luring enemies away, on the other hand, seemed far more effective. Rather than being constrained within the holy field, it was better to support Ultima and the others, drawing the enemy into uninhabited territory and annihilating them there. Guy couldn't help but praise Luminous internally. She was as reliable as ever. He felt genuine gratitude toward an ally who could reach the optimal solution in an instant. As Guy kept watch over the mutating Yivaraj, he also analyzed the terrifying power Veldanava had displayed. First and foremost, this confirmed one thing. Veldanava was unquestionably the original. His attacks directly interfered with the souls of living beings, something not even Guy, a primordial demon, was capable of. That alone proved he was facing the true creator god. Yet, beyond shock, Guy felt deep disdain for this method. It was a profoundly bad sign. Normally, an attack must break through the material body, spiritual body, and astral body in sequence. Veldanava ignored all of these steps. Once the soul itself was directly interfered with, life and death fell completely under his control. And crucially, Veldanava's attacks were multi-dimensional continuous assaults. Even Velgrin's parallel existence couldn't evade such targeting. This made Guy extremely wary. This was a gamble where a single failure meant total annihilation. Even for Guy, encountering this for the first time would leave him nearly helpless. Even going all out with his authority might not guarantee victory. And yet, in the face of such a lethal threat, Rimuru appeared strangely calm, so much so that, from Guy's perspective, it bordered on the irrational. First was the evolution of the pseudo-soul. Guy could clearly see the light of Rimuru's pseudo-soul shining within him. What had once been a container forged from magisteel, now bathed in Rimuru's magicules, had evolved into Haihirokan, the god-level ultimate metal. Second was the paradox of existence. Under normal circumstances, a pseudo-soul was supposed to generate self-awareness by referencing an original true soul. And yet, Rimuru undeniably had no soul at all, while still moving and acting purely through his own will. Veldanava interpreted this as a highly advanced automaton, a golem implanted with complex programs. Logically, that explanation made sense, but Guy rejected it outright. He knew Rimuru too well. No program could ever perfectly reproduce Rimuru's unique personality and behavior. What truly convinced Guy that this was the real Rimuru were the outrageous feats he had just performed. First was Benimaru's treatment. Without relying on standard authorities, Rimuru had converted extremely dangerous nihilistic energy into life-compatible energy and injected it into Benimaru. Guy couldn't help but curse inwardly. This wasn't just a divine technique, it was lunacy. Theoretically possible, yes, but a single misstep would mean annihilation. More than admiration, Guy felt sheer exasperation. Rimuru always showed him heights that defied imagination. Then there was Ramiris' evolution. The moment she entered a certain agreement with Rimuru, she instantly evolved from a tiny fairy into the full-fledged Queen of Spirits. To Guy, that was equally absurd. Putting aside how Rimuru did it, Guy reached a clear conclusion: the ability to convert deadly, law-breaking energy into power that others could safely use. This kind of irrational, extremely dangerous, yet miraculous operation was something no programmed doll could ever achieve. Rimuru had no soul, and yet that Rimuru was undeniably Rimuru. It made no conventional sense, but Rimuru himself had always embodied impossibility and miracles. Guy watched this unprecedentedly serious Rimuru. The slime, who normally acted carefree and constantly tried to dodge responsibility, was now actively seeking battle. On one side stood Veldanava, the creator god and former friend. On the other stood Rimuru, one of the octagram demon lords and Guy's acknowledged companion. Which of the two would prove stronger? With equal parts curiosity and trust, Guy chose to step back, assuming the role of observer, watching as a decisive clash that would determine the fate of the world was about to unfold. Next, the perspective shifted to Velzard. Although Velzard had chosen to stand with Rimuru rather than her brother, and although she knew better than anyone that Rimuru had once taken care of her, Veldora, and Velgrind, and that his true depth was unfathomable, before the battle began, she honestly believed their chances of victory were slim. In truth, she had already prepared herself mentally. Even if victory was impossible, she was resolved to fight until the very last moment and demonstrate their will. Her original expectation had been straightforward. First defeat Yivaraj, then gather everyone and launch a desperate, all-out assault against Veldanava. Reality, however, struck her far harder than anticipated. Rimuru, without any support at all, had managed to hold Veldanava in a one-on-one deadlock. For Velzard, it was a sight so unbelievable that she briefly doubted her own eyes. That fragile equilibrium did not last long. Veldanava soon revealed the indisputable power of a true god. It manifested in two absolute aspects. The first was the unavoidable attack. Veldanava's strikes ignored all authorities, energy reserves, and offensive or defensive values, directly seizing the target's soul. The second was the logic of instant death. The self and all skills and authorities resided within the soul. Once the soul was taken, the battle was over. It was a method that discarded all reason, concerned only with achieving the result. Velzard was convinced that even she, a true dragon, would be instantly killed if struck by it. Rimuru's earlier collapse had been the clearest proof of this law. Just as Velzard thought it was totally impossible to defeat her brother, Rimuru stood up again. What appeared before her was an absolute contradiction of existence itself, a being that had lost its soul, yet continued to act solely through self-awareness. This directly violated Veldanava's design philosophy as the creator. Velzard's shock condensed into one word: impossible. Not only that, Rimuru actively proposed a one-on-one confrontation with Veldanava and warned everyone else to stay back. Velzard deduced the reason immediately. Rimuru no longer had a soul to steal. As long as Veldanava did not physically interfere with his infon, Rimuru would not be affected. At the same time, Velzard keenly sensed a subtle shift in Veldanava's mindset, and from it she inferred a path to victory. Her brother had already abandoned true omniscience and omnipotence. The Veldanava standing before them was no longer an absolute, unified being. Therefore, things could not go exactly as he wished. Though he appeared calm on the surface, his attempt to ambush Rimuru betrayed impatience. A truly absolute being would have crushed the enemy head-on. Resorting to a sneak attack meant that Veldanava saw Rimuru as a danger that had to be eliminated quickly. Velzard became certain Rimuru's existence had already exceeded Veldanava's imagination. He was a rule-breaking singularity, harboring an unknown danger that could even destroy a god. Veldanava then committed a fatal mistake. His ambush failed to kill Rimuru, and instead gravely wounded Benimaru, who had stepped forward to protect his lord. Velzard knew Rimuru well. Rimuru could endure personal injustice, but he absolutely could not tolerate his companions being hurt. His sensitivity to others' pain far surpassed his concern for himself. As expected, this strike completely enraged him. All the confusion and hesitation born from the fact that his opponent was a former friend of his friend's, Milim's father, vanished in an instant, replaced by pure, unfiltered fury. There was no longer any doubt in Rimuru's eyes. He had clearly defined what he had to do: slay a god. Velzard decided to witness the conclusion of this battle. To avoid being caught in the aftermath, she pushed her authority to the absolute limit. Exploiting the nature of the stopped world, she deployed an optimal defensive measure: complete fixation. An absolute defensive barrier was erected around everyone gathered there, ensuring that as long as they were not struck directly, they would remain safe. Next came Milim's perspective. Milim immediately sensed the rage emanating from Rimuru. It was completely different from his usual easygoing demeanor. This level of seriousness was both extremely rare and terrifying. In Milim's heart, the father she barely felt any real connection to, Veldanava, was nowhere near as important as Rimuru. To her, a Veldanava who dared to anger Rimuru had simply brought this upon himself. Rimuru was often annoyed by Veldora, but that was mostly playful bickering. True, bottom-line rage was exceedingly rare. From Milim's perspective, it had happened only 3 times. The massacre triggered by the Kingdom of Falmouth, the moment Veldora was taken and controlled during the Empire War, and now. These events all shared one thing in common. Once Rimuru was truly enraged, he became utterly ruthless. Milim knew that Rimuru normally went to great lengths to restrain his power. He preferred dialogue, despised violence, and even sealed away authorities that were too dangerous. But once anger shattered the restraints of reason, he became a completely different being. Those forbidden, catastrophic powers would be released without hesitation. Milim could vaguely remember fragments of her own stampede rampage. At that time, Rimuru had been both gentle and strict, subduing her while protecting her at the same time. Only now did she realize with lingering fear that if Rimuru had aimed not for the best outcome, but for the total elimination of a world-level threat, she would have died. And under the circumstances back then, such an action would not even have been condemned. But he hadn't done that. That was who Rimuru was. Milim couldn't help but marvel at the fact that in less than 5 years, Rimuru had grown from a simple slime into a being capable of shaking the world. That alone was a miracle. More than that, Rimuru rejected survival of the fittest. In a world where the weak were powerless, he challenged common sense itself. He built a system in which everyone had value and could contribute. What was once dismissed as naive idealism ultimately won everyone over. Rimuru also pursued coexistence and boundaries. His principle was openness, respecting diversity. If values could not be reconciled, distance was maintained to avoid conflict. But if others tried to impose their rules through force, through invasion, he responded with merciless retaliation. To Rimuru, accumulating power was never about personal desire. It was about deterrence and protection. To protect what mattered, force was absolutely necessary. Based on this understanding, Milim reached her judgment. Rimuru amassed power to protect others and held a clear ideal. Her father, at least the Veldanava of now, was unquestionably the worst possible example. Rimuru once said, "Power without ideals will eventually become hollow." To Milim, that line had never been more fitting than it was for Veldanava at this very moment. Milim loved Rimuru, and she cared deeply for the gentle Benimaru. Supporting Rimuru in opposing her father and saving the world came naturally to her. But she also sensed the danger. Rimuru had already made his resolve. Ramiris's arrival had restored some of his reason, but Benimaru's life still hung in the balance. Once the real battle began, a Rimuru consumed by rage might lose control, perhaps even beyond his own ability to stop himself. Back then, it had been Rimuru who stopped Milim's stampede. This time, Milim silently swore to herself, if Rimuru were to fall into a path of slaughter, driven by rage, then she would be the one to stop him. Holding on to that heavy resolve and quiet prayer, Milim fixed her gaze on the battlefield, hoping for Rimuru's victory and for a future where everyone could once again laugh together. The perspective then shifted to Chloe. Chloe clearly understood that under the current circumstances, she was no longer able to contribute. Her own trump card had been completely sealed. With time frozen, her most significant authority, Time Leap, had lost all activation conditions. Without the ability to jump, she could no longer awaken memories from the future. Everything ahead was no longer a predetermined script, but a total unknown. While this was theoretically obvious, Chloe felt it far more painfully through her direct clash with Veldanava. All the combat experience she had accumulated across countless cycles had become meaningless in a battle against the god. At this point, all hope rested solely on Rimuru. As she looked at him, Chloe found herself contemplating the very essence of life. First came the collapse of common sense. Chloe had long believed that a person's essence was expressed through the form of the soul. Yet Rimuru, standing before her, completely overturned that truth. His soul had clearly vanished, stolen by Veldanava, yet he continued to act, unharmed and resolute. Then there was the abnormal radiance. This impossible mode of existence shook her deeply. In Chloe's vision, Rimuru's overwhelming will had transformed into a brilliant, dazzling light. She was drawn to that light. In a situation that should have inspired absolute despair, her unease faded away almost miraculously as she gazed upon it. Chloe realized that this was the moment she had reached after countless tragic loops, the culmination of everything. This was the final stage. The road ahead could not be seen, yet she had undeniably arrived here. It was now a fight with no retreat. From the moment Veldanava activated Time Stop, the door back to the past had closed. If Rimuru were to fall here, everything would truly end. Pushed to this extreme, Chloe arrived at a radical conclusion born from her past cycles, and from it, an unshakable belief. Rimuru would find a way. She had witnessed innumerable futures where Rimuru vanished or was destroyed. Yet, she suddenly realized something crucial. She had never personally witnessed the exact moment of Rimuru's true death. That realization overturned her long-held assumptions. If the current Rimuru could exist without a soul, sustained purely by will, then that fact alone was enough to invalidate all prior observations. A new conclusion emerged. In those past timelines, where she had believed Rimuru died, it might simply have been an error born of common sense. Perhaps in those futures as well, he had survived in some form. Across every timeline, Rimuru may never have truly died. Though the present looked like the end of the world, Chloe believed time would move again, and the path to the future had never been cut off. The intense light radiating from Rimuru was proof that he had not given up, that his will remained unbroken. That alone was enough for Chloe to trust him. She needed no future memories to validate it. With that belief, Chloe quietly watched the battlefield, praying for Rimuru's victory, and for the radiant future that surely awaited beyond it. Finally, the perspective moved to Ramiris. At first, Ramiris did not grasp the gravity of the situation. She had not even realized that she herself could move within the stopped world. She assumed it was just another strange but harmless anomaly. It was only when Zhejian sent an overwhelmingly loud thought communication, so loud it felt like noise, that she began complaining and realized that only she and Zhejian could act. Their mission had always been to protect the labyrinth, but in a frozen world, that duty seemed meaningless. Zhejian urged Ramiris to head to the battlefield, telling her that she could still play a role even with time stopped. Though shocked that Zhejian could use spatial transfer under such conditions, Ramiris followed him regardless. Upon reaching the battlefield by tracing Rimuru's presence, Ramiris was hit by a series of shocks. First was her lukewarm entrance. She had dramatically shouted, "Wait a second," and made what she thought was a heroic save. But the reactions she received were oddly flat. Everyone simply questioned why she was even there, which left her unexpectedly discouraged. In truth, everyone was focused on the fact that she could move in the stopped world, while Ramiris herself was convinced she had just saved the entire situation. The second shock was Rimuru's condition. She was stunned to see that Rimuru, despite having no soul, was not only alive, but was performing healing on an entirely different dimensional level. As a veteran Rimuru fan, she quickly convinced herself that this was normal. After all, it was Rimuru. The third shock was Veldanava's revival. Ramiris had not even known he had been revived, a dead creator. God returning to life sounded utterly absurd. Though confused, she forced herself to calm down and observe the situation carefully. While her memories were somewhat hazy, Ramiris remembered Veldanava's personality clearly, warm, curious, and endlessly fascinated by everything. The Veldanava before her now, though identical in appearance, was completely different. He was not raging, but instead radiated despair and indifference, as though he had lost interest in all things. That realization filled Ramiris with quiet sorrow. The passionate god who never gave up was gone. Instinctively, Ramiris began comparing Rimuru and Veldanava. Though they were clearly separate beings, Rimuru carried a strangely nostalgic feeling. She sensed that Rimuru possessed exactly what Veldanava had lost. Once that thought took root, it refused to leave her mind. This time, Ramiris seemed convinced. Rimuru was that person. Putting those thoughts aside, Ramiris decided to honor her promise and save Benimaru first. Though Rimuru had performed emergency treatment, Benimaru's core could not function while time was stopped. Still, the energy Rimuru had injected not only stabilized him, it had triggered evolution. Through the soul corridor, Ramiris borrowed Rimuru's power, and instantly regained an adult form that should have taken at least 50 more years to reach. That alone demonstrated how abnormal Rimuru was, but Ramiris didn't dwell on it. After all, it was Rimuru. Ramiris then displayed a supreme power beyond all laws, primitive magic. It was a force that ignored rules entirely, capable of producing miracles through sheer will. With it, she successfully restarted Benimaru's core. After saving him, Ramiris fell into thought. If her hypothesis about Rimuru was correct, then perhaps the two did not need to fight at all. But the answer remained unknown. Only when the battle ended would everything be revealed. Ramiris firmly believed that Rimuru would bring forth the correct answer. Thus, the fully restored Spirit Queen quietly stepped aside, praying for Rimuru's victory. Alright, that was all for this video. This episode mainly served as a supplement to the previous 2 episodes, re-examining the battle between Rimuru and Veldanava from third-party perspectives. The core focus, of course, was Rimuru's overwhelming abnormality. From Guy's perspective, even though Rimuru possessed a pseudo-soul, he could not be regarded as a soulless puppet. This was thanks to Seal's actions in the previous episode. To clarify, Veldanava's soul domination was a multi-timeline continuous attack, meaning even the backup soul stored within Veldora would have been taken. Seal's response was to separate Rimuru's ego and core, leaving the ego backed up within Veldora through the soul corridor, and then restoring Rimuru via the pseudo-soul. As we mentioned before, Seal had concluded that Rimuru's probability of defeating Veldanava was 100%. As a result, the ego she left behind was capable of displaying extraordinary power, something we would see in the coming episodes. Second was Velzard's realization that Veldanava had abandoned omniscience and omnipotence, a point we had already covered in detail back in episode 56. Third was Chloe's reflection on her countless past loops. Since Chloe had never actually witnessed Rimuru's true death, she arrived, perhaps for the first time, at the hypothesis that Rimuru may never have died in any timeline at all, and that everything she had observed might have been part of a predetermined cycle. Finally, there was Ramiris' assessment of Rimuru's identity. While the author had not explicitly confirmed it yet, from Ramiris' perspective, there were two key factors. One was that she had clearly sensed nihilistic collapse within Rimuru. The other was that Rimuru radiated the warmth that Veldanava had lost. Rimuru represented the full evolution of the world's system itself. In that sense, the two might not need to fight at all, because Rimuru's existence was meant to fill the void Veldanava had left behind. Of course, we would be doing a full analysis of their relationship in the near future. In our next episode, a Rimuru who had lost Seal would finally have the chance to return to a male form, and in his battle against Veldanava, he would gradually seize the initiative. The next episode would be just as exciting. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support was greatly appreciated. See you in the next one.